Good morning or evening or whenever you happen to be watching this. It's good to be speaking to you. It's not ideal to be speaking to you under these circumstances, but we will make do with what we have available to us. And this morning, or this evening, or whenever you're listening, today we're going to take a look in 1 Samuel chapter 2. So if you want to go ahead and be opening up to 1 Samuel chapter 2, that's where we're going to be taking a look. And you can follow along with us. We're going to start in chapter 1 actually, but we'll get to chapter 2 very shortly. So 1 Samuel, go ahead and open up there. And as you are opening up there, as we start, I'm going to remind you of a phrase that I've used and borrowed from Ronald Reagan on a few occasions. And it's a very simple quote, but it says that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Now, hopefully the point is not lost on you anyway, but certainly there's a spiritual point and application that we can make as well. So spiritually speaking, we are not guaranteed that either in our own families or in the church family, within the church, the congregation that we attend, we're not guaranteed that the faith that we have will be the faith that the next generation has, or that they will even have any faith. But instead, it's up to us to ensure that that faith stays the same, that the faith is kept both within our own families and within the church family. We're going to talk about both of those as we go through this lesson, and we're going to do so looking at the example of Eli and the failure of Eli, I suppose, with his two sons. So we're going to take a look at that, and we're going to look, of course, starting out with some background. And as far as the background goes, the first thing we need to know is when this is happening. And this is happening about 1,100 years before Christ. About 1,100 years before Christ, and this places it at the end of the time of the judges and the beginning of the time of the kings. So this is just a couple decades before Saul is anointed as Israel's first king, and it's amongst the last of the judges. So that places us historically where we're at, but then we also want to look at the context of our story. And we're going to start in 1 Samuel chapter 1, looking at verse 3. So in verse 3, it introduces us to some characters. It's already introduced us to Hannah and Elkanah, who are not the focus of our story today. But in verse 3 it says that this man, Elkanah, went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh. Also, the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priest of the Lord, were there. So in this book, it starts out assuming that we will already know who these priests are and that they are already in place. It just states as fact that these are the priests of the Lord. Now, why are there three listed? Well, Eli, at this point, is older, and he's actually no longer the priest, but his son, Phinehas, is serving as the high priest. And these men are the high priest, not just some of the priests, but they're the high priest, which means that they are the uppermost authority in the Jewish religion on earth. So these high priests come from the line of Aaron, and that's true for Eli as well. It's thought that he comes through Ithamar, the son of Aaron, and that he's a descendant in that line. But it talks about him here, and it says that he's the high priest, or was the high priest at least. But later on throughout this chapter, we understand that he's a pretty good high priest, or a pretty good person in general. In the later part of the chapter, in verse 17 of chapter 1 still, speaking with Hannah, it says that he spoke to her, saying, "Go in peace, the God of Israel grant your petition, which you have asked of him." So Eli's not a bad man, and he's not a bad priest, but he may be a bad father. And we're going to see that as we continue on here. But we get to see him, or introduced with him, we get to see his sons, both Hophni, or Hophni, and Phinehas. And these two men are wicked. That's the way that they'll be described repeatedly in these couple of chapters, and they will be punished as a result. But they both served alongside Eli in the priesthood and in the tabernacle. This is before the days of the temple that Solomon would build later. So they serve in the tabernacle, but they are wicked. Now sometimes, especially in ancient times and in the Hebrew culture, names carried a lot of meaning, maybe more meaning than they do today. And looking at the names of these three men, we might be able to introduce some helpful information about them. Starting with Eli, his name means to raise up or to offer up. Now, that probably refers to the sacrifices that he would be making. It seems that that's a very appropriate name for a priest. But then what are the names of his sons? Well, Hophni, the meaning of the name, that is, means one of two things. It can either mean a boxer or a handful. Now, neither of those are great ways to be described as far as your character goes. So either he's sort of rebellious and a fighter, or he is a handful, and we would understand what that means. And Phinehas is no better. In fact, he may be worse, because his name means, at least in some translations, mouth of a serpent. So you can understand that he's probably not the best either, and maybe you would even say that he's clever in speech, given that illustration that we use sometimes. So their names may indicate some of their personality traits, and they certainly fit with the personalities that we're going to see. But these sons of Eli serve as a foil, which is a contrast, a character contrast, to another individual in this story. And the other individual is Samuel, the namesake of the book. Samuel is a good child. In fact, he's a very good child, and he'll grow up to be a great man, remembered for his faith. But he sets the counterexample to these two wicked sons of Eli. In chapter 2 and verse 26, Samuel is described as a type, antitype of Christ. In verse 26, chapter 2, it says, "And the child Samuel grew in stature and in favor, both with the Lord and men." Now that's the same as Luke chapter 2 and verse 52, speaking about Christ. Again, there's that parallel there showing that Samuel is going to be good and the sons of Eli are going to be wicked. So with those things under our belt, we can move on to take a look at the sons themselves. So looking in chapter 2, starting in verse 12. Read verse 12 with me. It says, "Now the sons of Eli were corrupt, and they did not know the Lord." Well, they've got two problems already. They are corrupt, and they don't know the Lord. What does it mean that they are corrupt? Well, more literally, that's a two-part word that means to have value and not. What it's saying is they are worthless. They are invaluable in the negative sense, without value. They are good for nothing. And that sounds very harsh, but that's the way the Bible describes them. And certainly the Spirit is correct in his estimation of their soul being able to see into the heart of these men. So they are corrupt. And why are they corrupt? Well, the next line explains it. It says they did not know the Lord. Now, one point of emphasis might be that it says Lord here with all capital letters, at least in the King James, New King James. It says L-O-R-D, all capital letters, which indicates, as we've talked about somewhat recently, that it is a stand-in for the name, the Hebrew name, Yahweh. So it's not just saying that they did not know God at all, or any God, it's that they didn't know Yahweh, the personal God of Israel. They were ignorant of him, so of course they were going to behave wickedly. So one question, though, that's important that comes up in this study is how is it that these two sons of Eli were sons of the high priest, and they were in the tabernacle their entire childhood, we would have to assume, and they've even served in the tabernacle for years. How is it that they did not know the Lord? Let me suggest right now, we'll get back to this at the end of the lesson, but let me suggest that being in the tabernacle and being the child of someone that is faithful is not enough to ensure that you will be faithful. And that has great application for modern day. Just because someone grows up in the church and just because someone's parents are faithful, that does not have any guarantee of that person's faithfulness to God. And that certainly is the case here with these, and it's certainly the case of many people that we know as well. Looking a little bit farther in verses 13 and 14, we won't read these, but let me explain that there are two sins primarily that these two sons are guilty of. So the first sin that Hophni and Phinehas are guilty of is taking meat from the Lord. Now, under the Old Testament system, according to Leviticus chapter 7, verses 31 and 32, they had the right to take some of the meat of whatever was offered. And specifically, they were allowed, the priests were, the breast meat and the thigh meat of any offering that was on the altar. And they could take that and they could eat that. But in this case, the sons have chosen to take whatever they want. So essentially, they're robbing God of the offering that is rightly due him. And that's never a good situation to put yourself into, to rob God, as Malachi talks about. So that's one of the sins that they have, but the other sin is in the next couple verses, 15 and 16, and we see that they are not satisfied with disobeying the Lord in one area, but they also disobey him in another area. So in verses 15 and 16, they would take the fat that was supposed to be offered up, and they would take that and not allow it to be burned up, but take that as well. Now, again, according to Leviticus in chapter 7, verse 25 this time, we know that the fat was supposed to be burned up entirely. The priest was not to have anything to do with it. But if you're going to be guilty in one area, you might as well be guilty in another. And it's very doubtful that these were the only two sins of Hophni and Phinehas, but these are the ones that are recorded for us. But in verse 17, it adds a little bit extra to this. Verse 17 of chapter 2, it says, "Therefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord." It's easy enough to understand that their sin was great. We understand that they were disobeying God, they were not keeping his law, but is that the reason in verse 17 that it says that they were so guilty? Is that the reason that their sin was so great? And the answer is no. It's not that their sin was so great because they had hurt themselves by this sin. It's not that their sin was so great because they had broken God's law, even though that's a bad thing to do. But in verse 17 it says that their sin was great because they caused men to despise the offering of the Lord. The sin that made them so bad in the eyes of God was not about breaking his law, was not about being bad people in general, but was about misleading others. God does not take kindly to people, especially people as the priest were supposed to be in positions of authority and leading his people in the faith and in the truth. He doesn't take kindly to them misleading or leading astray the people, and that's exactly what they were doing. And that's why they're going to be punished and why their punishment will be so severe, because they've caused people to hate God's sacrifices, and that is not okay. Now, next thing that we want to look at is Eli's one attempt that we get to see of him trying to correct his son's behavior. Now, there's obviously some failing on Eli's part throughout their childhood, or at some point in their childhood, or there's something that is otherwise wrong with these two, but Eli is not without guilt in the situation. But he does try to correct it down in verse 22. In verse 22 it says, "Now Eli was very old, and he heard everything that his sons did to all Israel, and how they would lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And so he said to them, Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all the people. No, my sons, for it is not a good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people transgress." Verse 25 condemns them even farther by saying, "If one man sins against another, God will judge him, but if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him?" Nevertheless, they did not heed the voice of their father, because the Lord desired to kill them. So the sons here of Eli are not in a good situation, and they are going to be punished thoroughly, and we'll see that happen shortly in the book. But it's because of their sin, and it's because they sinned not just in general, but against the Lord himself. Now, how did they do that? It's the same way that we've already seen. They sinned not just against the law, that's a bad thing. They sinned not just against themselves, that's a bad thing too. But they misled other people, and they turned them away from God. That's the sin that seems to be the one against God himself, for which no intercession is made. And that's a scary prospect. So Eli tries, though, in his old age, and we don't know exactly how old he is, but he tries in his old age to correct his sons. God does not give him a pass on this, saying, well, you're a little too old and you probably can't have any influence on them. He says, you're still responsible and you should go to them. He does, but he's already failed his responsibility. He's already raised bad children. At this point, it's too little too late. So there's a prophecy that happens here starting in the next couple of verses, and we won't read all of this, but all the way through the next several verses, we see a man of the Lord come to them. Now, it doesn't say who this man of God is in verse 27. It just says that it's a man of God, which would be another prophet. And he comes to Eli and he tells him 5 things, and none of them are good. But because of his son's sin and because of his own failing as a father, there will be 5 punishments enacted. Starting with this. The first thing that will happen is that they will be cut off from Israel. Now, whenever you're cut off, that most likely or most of the time means that you're going to die. But not just that, but Israel is going to be invaded as a result of their sinful behavior. The third thing is that the descendants of Eli are all going to die young. None of them are going to live to old age, and that's true as well. It's fulfilled later on. The fourth thing is that his sons will die on the same day. So both of his sons will die on the same day. And the fifth thing is that his household will be replaced as the line of high priest. So those 5 things put together are all pretty bad, and it's all the result of the sins both of the sons of Eli and the failing of Eli as a parent. But that's the situation that we find ourselves in as the result of this, and all of these things will come to pass. It is true that the sons of Phinehas, or the sons of Eli, Phinehas and Hophni, will die on the same day, along with 30,000 other Israelites that will die in battle. It's also true that the Philistines will come in, they will even capture the Ark of the Covenant and take it away, and everything's going to go pretty poorly. Even Eli himself will die when he hears the news of everything that's happened. So these things will be fulfilled in short order, and it's all because of the sin of 2 children and the failing of one father. What can we learn from this? There are several lessons that I'd like to point out that hopefully we can understand, but we'll start again with where we began at the beginning. We'll start with the quote from Reagan, but this time we'll give more of the quote. So let me go ahead and read that and we'll apply it again. It says that freedom is never more than 1 generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream, but it must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free. Now there's an obvious application for that as far as our nation's concerned, but there's another application worth making, the spiritual one. The spiritual one is that we cannot wait for someone else to take care of our responsibility. And specifically when it comes to our faith and passing it on to the next generation, we cannot wait for someone else to step up. We can't wait for someone else to raise our children faithfully. We cannot wait for someone else to step up and convert them. But that's true of parents and children, and it's also true of the church and the eldership of the church and the flock that they care for. So we as parents cannot say, well, someone else can do that. And surely our children will be raised faithfully somehow. But we have to be the ones responsible. The same thing is true of the church and with the elders. We can't assume that the future is going to be okay and that everyone's going to be faithful and that this church will last for another 100 years as it has for the last 100 without taking precautions for it. It means those decisions that we make cannot be based on the short term but must be long-term beneficial decisions. So the second lesson here is that the church, and this is an important lesson, so I'll repeat it a couple times, but the church will not convert your children. Let me say that again. The church will not convert your children. You will, or you will not. And again, we're not talking about just them being baptized, not just them being dunked in water, but what we're saying is they will not give their life to Christ just because they come to church. They will give their life to Christ because of what they see their parents do and how they see their parents act and what their parents teach them. The church will not convert your children. It cannot. It did not work whenever Eli tried it before. Eli assumed that his children would be faithful because they grew up in the church, in the tabernacle, that is, but they grew up well-churched. They grew up around faithful people all the time, and they had an example of faith in their parent, but that wasn't enough. So we cannot expect that that will happen without our doing so. So if there's something that in our lives we show to our children that it is more important than the church, if we think that school is more important than church, or social events, or friends, or work, or whatever it is, if there's something more important than the church, our children will pick up on that if we think it's more important, and they'll think it's more important. And when we look back several years from now and we look to the next generation, we'll see fewer and fewer people in the church for the same reason that Eli found that his sons were unfaithful. Because he assumed that it would happen, but it didn't happen because the church is not the one that will convert your children. A third lesson is this, that old age is not an excuse. Now, Eli, again, we don't know exactly how old he is, but it's evident that he was quite old, especially for his time. And Eli is not free from the responsibility that he has to God. He had a charge to keep, and he fails to do so. And Eli is still punished as a result. Even though his children are grown, even though you might be able to say that he didn't have the influence over them that he once did, he is still held responsible to whatever extent is possible by God for the wickedness of his sons. And the real lesson here, though, is that we can use whatever time that we have to influence those people that are close to us for good. And whether we only have a few years left or whether we have many, many years left, it doesn't matter. We can use the time that we have to leave a lasting impact, to leave a lasting legacy on the next generation so that that generation is in fact faithful. Another lesson, kind of the opposite of that, is that youth is not an excuse either. The sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were not excused because they were young. God didn't say, well, because you're not so old yet and you don't have the experience and the wisdom of life, you will get a free pass on sin. Instead, God holds them responsible. And in our situation, looking at our children, the same thing would be true, saying that if our children do not take God seriously now, take the church seriously now, the world is not going to wait for them. The world isn't going to wait until they've made that choice to give their life to God. Instead, the world is already ready to offer them 1,000 different kinds of sins and temptations for them to take part in, and 1,000 different kinds of false teaching that will draw them away from God. That's already available, and it's already seeking them out by Satan's doing. So we cannot wait for youth to make that decision, because the world has already made its decision on who it follows, and the world is already going to influence our children for the worse. So youth is not an excuse to not take God seriously, and youth is not an excuse to partake in sinful behavior. Another lesson, and this is the last lesson, we said at the beginning that Samuel serves as the contrast for our two wicked sons here of Phinehas and Hophni. So he's the contrast. He's the good child. He's the one that actually follows God. But why did it happen? Why is Samuel faithful and ends up being a great man of faith, and then the sons of Eli, the sons of the priest, end up being unfaithful? Samuel doesn't have a heritage of great faith. Now, certainly his mother had great faith. I'm not trying to say that. But his parents weren't preachers or teachers or prophets or priests, but they were nobodies by comparison to Eli, who's the high priest, the most important man in all of Israel. So why is it that Samuel is faithful when they were not? Well, the reality is Samuel, by his parents' choice, made an intentional choice to give him to God. An intentional choice to give him to God. Every action that they took was to help make sure that their child would keep their faith to the next generation. Instead, the opposite of that, the contrast of that, is Eli, who assumed that because his children were around faithful people, because his children were brought to church, again the tabernacle, but brought to church because his children had their example in their father of a great man of faith, he assumed that they would be faithful. Samuel's parents made sure that that would take place. The lesson for us is this: don't leave your future up to chance. Now that's true in a couple ways. Number one, with your children. Don't leave your children's future up to chance. Don't assume that them going to church is going to help them be converted. I hope it does. That's part of the reason that we meet together, but at the same time, you are the one that has the most influence on them, and it's you that's going to convert them or not. The second thing is for the church. When we talk about the church, we want to make sure that we don't leave the future of the church up to chance. It's not enough to say, well, we assume that the church will do fine. We assume that the church will be good 50 years from now, 80 years from now. Instead, we have to make sure that that happens. We have to lay out the structure, the foundation, the groundwork so that that can take place. The last part of this is that we cannot leave our own futures up to chance. I can't leave my future up to chance. You can't leave your future up to chance. Why? Well, number one, because it's too important, but also because if we do, then we risk or run the risk of an eternal condemnation, and that is too important for us to ignore. Don't leave your future up to chance. Instead of leaving your future up to chance is a great opportunity, even while we're not meeting. If you're not a child of God, this is a great time to become a child of God. It takes hold of your own future. It also sets a great example for your family, and it sets a great example for the church. If you're already a child of God, then rededicating your life to God is a great example to yourself, to the church, to your family. If you need assistance with that, just because we're not meeting, that doesn't mean that we are not wanting to help you. If you do need any help, reach out to us, to me, to one of the elders, and we will make sure that you get whatever it is you need or any other need that you have, whether spiritual or not. Just reach out and let us know. Thank you for listening, and we'll be talking to you again soon. Take care, and we'll see you again.